All right, welcome back to the Nexus Podcast. Christopher Frenz, a longtime healthcare CISO and O'Reilly co-author of a book called Evidence-Based Security, joins me for today's episode. We're in for a very interesting discussion on his approach to protecting critical systems, an approach based on science principles, something that is very close to Chris's background. I think this is going to be a real eye-opener for a lot of security leaders who have invested some money in security technology, but maybe aren't so sure how to effectively measure whether these tools are performing up to par. Before we get started, just my usual pitch for you to subscribe to the podcast. If you haven't already, if you're listening, really appreciate it. We are on all the major platforms, so we're pretty easy to find. Also, we're somehow closing in on the end of the year, and I have to take a second to thank all of my guests. I've done probably 25 episodes so far this year, probably 30 by the time the year ends, and I'm really blown away by the time and the quality discussions that each of my guests have given me. So my genuine thanks and appreciation to all of you. And again, if you're listening, please subscribe. All right, let's get started with today's episode. Hey, Chris, great to see you again. How you doing?
Great to see you as well. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for giving me the time. I know we met briefly at Nexus Conference a couple of weeks ago, where I heard your talk on this topic of evidence-based security, and I definitely wanted to explore it a little bit more here on the podcast. So thanks again for coming on. Just kind of wanted to start like with a table setter. I'm always interested in people's career paths, and I know you have a science background. Tell me a little bit about that and how you ended up in security.
I've been in healthcare for about 25 years now. I actually got my start as a scientist. So I used to be a drug designer who used to develop software to design pharmaceuticals. And back about 20 years ago, I started taking interest in all these security flaws I noticed in software I was developing, as well as that of my colleagues. And that got me really interested in the security side of things. So over time, kind of transitioned away from my scientific background and more towards a security-focused background. But with that being said, I kind of always kept those security roots and principles in how I approach security. So it's always kept the scientific background alive and brought it with me to my approaches to security. And I've been in healthcare 25 years, with the last 15 in the role of a CISO at various health systems.
So it's really informed kind of how you've just developed your security career.
Definitely, because one of the things is in science, you don't take anything for granted. You always want to test and measure everything. Sure. And I've kind of tried to bring that same approach to how I do security.
Mm-hmm. So I guess a good place to start is just from a high level. I know you've co-authored a book on this, but just explain from a high level what you're talking about when we're talking about evidence-based security and what it means in this context.
Sure. I think one of the issues with security today is we often treat security much more as an art form than a science. And we have a lot of compliance-based approaches that look for the existence of certain controls, but we don't really spend as much time focusing on the efficacy of controls. So for example, today I have a firewall. I get 5 points on whatever compliance framework it is, but it doesn't really test to see if you have all the proper rules in the firewall. Are you doing egress filtering correctly? Are other things within that control configured properly? We don't really check that. So one of the things I'm very big on is actually measuring to see if the efficacy of various controls is actually in place. And this goes back to an exercise that I did in 2015 at a hospital that I worked for at the time. We became very interested in what would happen if a ransomware attack were to outbreak within the organization. So one of the things we did is we did a simulation of a ransomware attack where we took the iCar test string and wrote a script to attempt to copy it to every computer in the organization to simulate the spread of malware through the organization. And we learned a lot of interesting things about what worked, what didn't work, as well as how people responded to an incident like that. So it was a very eye-opening exercise to actually go ahead and measure security in that form. And one of the things that really stuck out, for instance, was the control of network segmentation. So at the time, back in 2015, we had a segmented network, which was significantly better than the flat networks most hospitals had at the time. But one of the things we noticed is that even though we had a control and actually had a working control, if the segmentation did work and did keep the malware contained, we learned that the control we had was nowhere near granular enough to actually meet our needs. So we had a case where we had a control, the control existed, it even worked to a degree, but it didn't work to the level of efficacy that was actually needed. And that kind of informed my approach from there on, because I started to ask the question of other types of controls in the organization too, is when tested against actual attack techniques, will this control actually hold up with the needed level of efficacy? And oftentimes you find that it does not. So the evidence-based security approach I really have is a framework where you figure out the threats that are pertinent to your environment. What are the risks that your environment faces? What are those threats? Figure out a way to simulate those threats using things like MITRE ATT&CK or other ways to look at the various tactics and techniques that an attacker will use for those threats. Figure out a way to develop metrics around measuring the impact of those threats on the environment, which may vary somewhat from control to control. Then go ahead and actually run the simulation, collect those metrics, see how the control stands up, and use that to make informed decisions as to how to modify the controls in your environment. And over time, you can use this type of approach to quantitatively show that changes you're making to your environment make the organization more and more secure.
Mm-hmm. So this really flies in the face of what some organizations may be doing in terms of approach of a checkbox approach to meet certain compliance mandates. I mean, I would hope that that's not the be all end all of a security program in 2025, but this really kind of shows that that doesn't work.
I would agree. I think compliance is important in the sense that it sets a bare minimum baseline, but I think compliance alone is often not enough. And we see this all the time where companies that are 100% compliant with all kinds of different standards still end up getting breached. And I think the reality is compliance is great for checking for the existence of certain controls, but it currently ignores the efficacy of controls. Mm-hmm. So this puts much more focus on not just having the control in the environment, but making sure you have a working control in the environment. And they're often two different things. And I think you see this a lot too, which to kind of prove the point is security investments currently at an all-time high. Organizations are spending more and more on security tools, security resources in various ways, but we're not really seeing better outcomes right now. Breaches and ransomware attacks are at record highs. And I think as an industry, we need to kind of step back and say, what are we doing wrong? And I think a big part of it is a lot of organizations create the illusion of security by deploying a bunch of controls, but because they never actually check for the efficacy of those controls, it's really much more of an illusion of security than an actual level of security.
I want to go back to something you said a second ago during the early testing of this in 2015. You learned that your segmentation wasn't granular enough, I think is how you put it. Can you kind of explain what you meant by the granularity you were looking for?
Sure.
Or were missing?
We were segmented by department, and the segmentation worked perfectly well to constrain the attack to whatever department we ran the script in. But given that we're a hospital, we rapidly learned that if we were to lose our entire emergency room or lose our entire radiology department or the lab or some other critical department to the organization, it was still going to effectively shut the organization down. So we had a working control, but the efficacy just wasn't there in the way it was deployed. And that actually took us down the road of zero trust. So we were actually the first hospital in the country to actually achieve a zero trust network.
Wow, interesting. So, and then are you retesting the simulation again, like once you get to a certain degree of confidence in it?
Yes, I'm very big on retesting to show that whatever mitigations you made and whatever remediations you made actually are effective, because you don't want to assume that just because you change something that the change is effective. You do want to verify that. So I'm very big on that. I'm also very big on using this as a way to develop metrics, particularly for reporting out to the board and other executives, because it provides a great way to show ROI of security. So you can show, for instance, that before a certain security initiative, and I'll make up some numbers here, you only stopped 20% of these TTPs from a certain attacker group. But after you did this particular security initiative, you're now stopping 80%. So it actually gives you a way to quantify that the security was actually improved within the organization. It's no longer me saying that the security is better because we did X. Now I can actually show that X had a quantifiable ROI for the organization in terms of improved attack resistance. So I'm very big on using this approach as the basics for a lot of metrics as well.
And are the simulations kind of the best way to test, whether the configurations you've changed or the controls you've added are effective, or are there other methods that you can rely on as well?
We do other things as well. So we do things like pen tests and other stuff to see if they hold up. But I'm very big on the attacker simulations, because at the end of the day, it's what we're trying to do is defend ourselves against attackers. So if we can look at the techniques that they're using to compromise other organizations within our space, it provides a very good way to evaluate how well the security is going to work against the threats you're likely to face.
Mm-hmm. Are you guys on an island in terms of taking this approach? I mean, I'm sure you've shared, your thoughts with peers, and I know you speak at conferences. Just kind of, what kind of feedback, what kind of interactions have you had?
I think you are seeing growing support for the approach. You are starting to see more and more standards start to recommend control validation. So you are seeing a bigger and bigger push for control validation. I think a lot more organizations starting to develop internal red and purple teams where they do these types of exercises to improve security. So I think you are seeing more and more buy-in to approaches like this. And I do think longer term, you'll see the cyber insurance industry actually push a lot of approaches like this, because I am starting to see insurance companies start to recommend that breach and attack simulations are used to kind of prove some of the security works before they set your rates. So I think over time there will be an economic incentive to adopt approaches like this as well.
Yeah, I mean, insurance is not a control by any means, but it's certainly becoming a major part of, at least for CISOs, a part of their strategy and a part of the controls that they implement.
Yes, and if you can get better rates from doing this approach, it'll make it more popular.
Right. All right, let's talk about the simulations themselves. Are these homegrown? Are you using platforms? I mean, you don't need to promote a platform you might be using, but just kind of take me inside how these are implemented and carried out.
It's been a mix of things over the years. So when I started doing it in 2015, there really were no platforms for doing it. So most of the testing we did was scripts and stuff that were written internally in order to run the tests. Today, there are a lot more platforms available. So you can actually buy a breach and attack simulation platform, which will do a lot of this for you. But there are also a lot of things you can do on your own. If you look at things like the LOL BAS project, that'll actually contain a lot of living off the land techniques attackers use. You can actually try a lot of those commands in your environment, see how they work. There's a lot of resources out there for documenting attacker behavior. A lot of threat intel reports too also demonstrate different commands and other techniques attackers used. So there are a lot of sources you can gather stuff from for the simulations. But having a breach and attack simulation platform definitely does make it easier, because you can automate and continually validate a lot of this stuff, and then focus your custom efforts on edge cases that those platforms may not cover.
What are, for lack of a better term, what are some of the inputs and outputs you get from these platforms?
I'm very big on trying to identify stuff that doesn't work. So I think one of the issues with a lot of security today is a lot of CISOs like to show dashboards and metrics that are kind of all green and show how wonderful the organization is. I think you see a lot of vanity metrics. You'll often have metrics like, my spam filter blocked 10,000 emails. And, okay, is that good? Is that bad? It's hard to tell because it's a vanity metric. There's no way to make that metric actionable. It doesn't provide any context in order to do that. And then if you take a look at even some of the more granular metrics that are not vanity metrics, things like KPIs and KRIs, there's definitely real value there. There is some level of actionability there, but in my opinion, they're often not granular enough. So if we take something like mean time to detection, most times it will tell you that you're not doing a great job detecting something in a timely manner, but it doesn't really tell you exactly what you can do to improve to make that better. Where if you take something like the more evidence-based security approach and you launch let's say, ransomware simulation that your mean time to detection was poor on, you can now see that my mean time to detection was bad because I failed to detect these 8 out of 10 TTPs this threat group used. So if I now build detections or add controls around those TTPs, my mean time to detection is going to improve as well. So I think it provides a lot more granular insights into how to improve a lot of security today. And I think overall, more organizations need to focus on metrics that don't necessarily always make the organization look good. Because I think we often learn more by figuring out what's not working and using that as a basis to improve upon.
And is that pretty evident when you get the results back from these simulations, or do you have to kind of dig in a little bit and apply it to your environment?
I think it can become pretty evident pretty fast. I think any organization where I've started doing this testing on, there's always things that don't work as well as most people assume they should when you first do the test. So you kind of do it to be prepared to not score as well as you think you're going to, but you have to adopt the mindset that that's a good thing because that's how you're going to improve.
And can you do a compare and contrast between this and, say, a red team exercise, for example?
I think the big difference is red team exercises are often point in time. This is a lot more on the continuous validation approach. It's a lot more on building metrics and a whole program around doing this. So I think red teaming is definitely a part of it, but I think it kind of goes a step beyond red teaming because it's using it as a way to actually set security strategy for the organization.
Mm-hmm. But these aren't continuous simulations. I mean, I assume you have some kind of cadence for them.
There is a cadence for it, so it's not like it runs and then runs again immediately after. The cadence somewhat depends on the control measuring some of the goals of the organization. So we do try to revalidate most controls on a monthly basis for things that we have established a high level of efficacy for, just to make sure that no change was made that brought the efficacy down. And kind of over time, I always try to expand to testing new areas as well.
And some of the other areas, I know how comprehensive is this across your program? Does it work equally well across the organization? Or
I've done this for a lot of different control types over the years. Some of the major focuses have been more around policies of network segmentation, policies and firewalls we've done. You can definitely do a lot in the EDR space and detections in that area, things like EDR, XDR. Similar for some of the network detections, you can try to laterally move through devices and see if you can detect the behavior. So there's a lot that can be done with approaches like this.
Mm-hmm. And how are you staying up to date on attacker TTPs? I mean, is it a threat intel feed? Does that work the best way or for you guys, or is it a manual process? How do you stay up to date?
Threat intel is definitely a big part of that. And that is one of the advantages, too, if you do have a breach and attack simulation platform, because usually they're very good at developing new playbooks in order to help you automate that stuff. But staying on top of threat intel and the latest attack vectors is always critical.
What have you seen lately on the threat front that kind of concerns you or at least intrigues you from a science perspective in terms of what, how quickly they're adapting or moving forward?
I think one of the things you're seeing more of is a shift away from some of the desktop-based threats. So for a long time, the workstations, the endpoints were often one of the bigger risk factors. But I think as organizations have gotten those locked better down with tools like EDR and other stuff, you're starting to see more and more of a shift towards going after some of the IoT and OT devices in an organization. So there's still a lot of focus on the desktop from attackers too. But I think you're starting to see more and more of a shift away from the desktop and towards other parts of the environment, just because detection is usually less robust there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that was one of the themes too that came out of Nexus conference was just from some of the talks was an increased focus on edge devices, for example, or systems that don't support EDR, for example. EDR does a pretty good job of catching stuff, but some of these devices that may not support it, that's kind of what's being targeted now.
Yes, it's become more of a path of least resistance or least likely to be detected.
Right. Is there kind of a level of maturity within an organization that needs to be in place for your approach to be effective? And if so, what does that look like? What has to be in place?
I think it's somewhat better with a mature organization. I would argue that if you can't meet basic compliance standards at all, where you're totally lacking classes of controls, it's probably better to focus on adding those first. But I think once you achieve the base level of compliance required for your industry, I think it's a very valuable approach to adopt early on.
Mm-hmm. And so tell me about the metrics. How have your metrics changed? How are you measuring success? I know you talked about, kind of getting rid of or avoiding vanity metrics, which makes total sense, but just bring me inside that part of it a little bit.
I think it's a different mindset, and you have to kind of sell to your organization early on that the metrics are not always going to be green, but that's a good thing. And it's because if you measure the same thing that you do a good job at over and over again every month, you're never going to get better. You're just going to kind of stay the same. But if you keep expanding what you're measuring and looking at, and look for things that you don't do well, that gives you an opportunity to improve. And there's much more improvement there. And it's a bit of a mindset difference, but I think overall, long term, it gives you a much better and more secure environment because you've identified all the things that you're not good at, because that's where the biggest learning opportunities are, as opposed to just revalidating, I do a good job at this over and over and over
Right.
again.
Does that take back the board or leadership above you a little bit when you kind of present the findings in that respect?
I've used this approach at two different organizations now. It's a little bit different than what they're traditionally used to seeing, but within a couple of board presentations, they grew to really like the approach simply because of the way to show ROI. Because for the first time, it wasn't the CISO saying that this investment made us more secure. It wasn't abstract like that. I could actually show the data behind it. So we were scoring this. Now we made these improvements, and now the metrics have gone up to show that we've now defend against all these additional TTPs that we were not before. So it's been a way to actually quantify that the investments they made were actually resulting in value to the organization, and not just an abstract opinion that things are better now.
Right. Was it a tough sell at the outset to go this way?
It wasn't as tough a sell as I thought it would be. Most boards have come around pretty quickly in my experience when they actually see it, because the ROI is something that's often missing from security, and this provided a way to show it. And it actually got to the point where I would get calls from board members every time a new ransomware attack or something made the news. Can you run a simulation on this? Because they wanted to see how the organization scored. And so it did result in a lot of buy-in, over time.
That's got to be pretty gratifying to get that kind of call. Hey, when they actually start talking about simulations and what you're specifically doing.
It worked actually to develop a security interest, because I think it really put security into language the business understand in terms of ROI. It wasn't just abstract anymore.
And was there something you were doing before that you've kind of like stopped in favor of this in terms of talking to the board and leadership?
And I think, prior to 2015, when I started really doing this approach, it was more the, traditional types of KPIs and KRIs that other leaders would use, because that was kind of the expected. And it wasn't until that I started doing the simulations myself and seeing how eye-opening it was, and how much we were missing in terms of what didn't actually work as well as we thought it did, that I started to shift more towards this approach.
I guess we should talk about your teams and how they adopt this approach. Just was there any pushback at the beginning from them, or just some trying? How did you get them to kind of come on board? Maybe not that they had a choice, but
they grew to like the approach very quickly. Is one of the things that worked out really well is a lot of the fires the organization was putting out prior to the approach started to go away, because as we tightened the environment up more and more, the organization became a lot less reactive and a lot more proactive. So it actually allowed people in the organization to grow and start to take on additional responsibilities in other areas, because they weren't spending all their time putting out fires anymore. So it made it from a reactive organization to a much more proactive organization. And overall, I think everybody came to appreciate that.
And are there only certain aspects of your team that are involved in this aspect of defending the whole program?
I think everybody plays a role to some extent, because it's it might be a dedicated person or two who actually runs the simulations and does that, but then they have to interact with other people within the team to put their remediations in and other mitigations where there are failures. So it definitely becomes a team effort where everybody has some form of role.
Mm-hmm. And how does it impact how you're putting the team together in terms of either new hires or skills you're looking for, training that you want to implement, things like that?
And I'm really big on growing people internally. So if I'm hiring, I'm looking more for, I guess, the ability to learn and to be passionate and to be interested in the topic. Usually pretty willing to train people internally and how we do things. So I don't know if it's really changed what I look for so much, simply because I've always looked for more, I guess, the ability for people to grow into a role, as opposed to having some of the knowledge at the time of hiring.
And is there like a baseline skill set that you need or you need to teach to make this successful?
Usually, a lot of people understand the defense side, but less so on the attack side. So I'm usually big on teaching the people who have to do defensive work a little bit about how attacks actually work, so they understand what they're trying to defend against.
Mm-hmm. And does that tie back to your science background in terms of, is that kind of a scientific approach in general? more offense versus defense, so to speak?
Never really thought about it in that context, but I would say, coming from a scientific background, I do think it's important to understand all the variables at play. I don't think you can solve an equation with only understanding half the picture. So it's I would say it does align with that.
So I'm just curious, a scenario, there's a new, excuse me, a new exploit out there, or a new 0-day or something. What does your team do in response to something like that in this context?
I think it works really well in that context, because one of the things is this approach has really forced us to redefine how we look at vulnerability management. So I think a lot of organizations, they don't really do vulnerability management as much as they do patch management. It's, you're missing these patches, apply the patch. And I'm not arguing that you shouldn't apply patches. Patches are critical. You should definitely apply patches. But if you start to take this approach, one of the things I think you notice is it shifts a lot of focus towards the idea of compensating controls. And so we start to ask the question not only of, what does this patch do, and how can we apply the patch and other stuff like that, but we start to ask the question of, in order to mitigate this vulnerability, in addition to the patch, what compensating controls can we put around that particular device? And so if you take something like a Log4j, if you had egress filtering in place as a compensating control, it was not as big an issue if you didn't have the compensating control, because you couldn't make the outbound LDAP connection to actually make the vulnerability exploitable. So there was a case there where compensating control actually effectively rendered the vulnerability significantly more difficult to actually exploit. And that's true with a lot of vulnerabilities you see. Take something like Print Nightmare. If you had the print spooler disabled on all the servers that you don't actually do printing on, it was largely a mitigated approach. So it's by asking the compensating control question, this approach really forces you to ask. I think it really prepares you for the next 0-day, because you're likely to find that you have a compensating control in place that will mitigate the 0-day out of the box until the patch can be applied. And I think that's a critical change the whole industry needs to make, because there's always another 0-day around the corner, and there may not be a patch available in time. But this approach kind of gets you to ask the compensating control question to make sure you're protected as can be, even in the absence of a patch.
Right. And I'm sure in your industry, compensating controls are kind of the lay of the land, given the patching difficulties and the hoops that updates have to go through before they reach your desk, I'm sure.
I would argue in healthcare and any kind of critical infrastructure industry where a lot of the devices are more challenging to patch, that's pretty true.
Yeah. All right. So kind of as a last question, Chris, before we wrap up, you've been doing this for 10 plus years, this kind of taking this approach. Are you kind of surprised it still works?
I don't think I'm surprised it still works, because it's, the numbers have always backed it up. It's always, I guess I've always been surprised how long, I guess, security has been treated more as the art form and not as the science. Right. And I think, I do think this approach is the future of how security is going to be done. Mm-hmm. And I'm just surprised, I guess, how long it took others to kind of come around to an approach like this.
Are you anecdotally at least hearing more organizations take this approach on, or something?
Definitely.
Similar?
I think with the rise of the breach and attack simulation industry, you have more and more of a push for the validation of controls. So I definitely think it's the direction the whole industry is going.
All right, we have a movement, I guess. All right, Chris, thank you so much for giving me the time. I thought this was a really great conversation, and I'm sure my listeners are going to really enjoy it. So appreciate you coming on the show and giving me the time.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Chris, take care.